morning, colleagues. Thanks, Mr. Tom, and everyone. I will definitely be brief, just to make a comment. Looking forward to Ms. Pango's presentation, of course, but also to congratulate Tom and your team, Shumi, for the journey well traveled. I mean, we are quite aware that this has been a long journey, and not necessarily an easy one to this day. So congratulations, and as important stakeholders from university side, I would like to just also indicate that it is one of those acts that we've been looking forward to, its implementation based on the experience, but most importantly also because embedded in it is or are issues of transformation, issues of redress, especially in the way our institutions also conducted research and innovation development and capacity building. It has been also important provisions for inclusivity, gender considerations, and participation of youth. So these are key ingredients for us, because as you know, universities are also not necessarily systematically and structurally arranged such that those principles of inclusivity and redress are easy to manage. So the Act also provides us some really useful tool to begin to engage. As a researcher myself, I'll tell you that it is almost every session that I have with traditional health practitioners, the issues embraced in the Act are critical to them. For example, the certification, the recognition of prior learning, the fact that they want to be acknowledged and recognized accordingly, are critical in the kind of wars and contestations that we're dealing with and they are dealing with. And so that also gives me a hard time to think about how do we start as professors who are responsible for mentoring, for capacitating, for inculcating values of doing decolonial research to our students. How do we begin to be empowered by this Act to propel the thinking and the culture on university grounds, so that our traditional health practitioners and knowledge holders becomes our partners in research, as opposed to the popular ivory tower notion of us going to extract and leaving them with nothing. So with that, I wish to indicate that we are quite aware that we, as key stakeholders, we have a core responsibility to make this Act known, to engage further. Because one of the experience that I have with my students, and they were reminding me this morning, is that we often realize as we interact at grassroots level that knowledge holders, community members, health practitioners, and so forth are not necessarily aware of the benefits that comes with it, let alone the content. And so I wish to indicate that it is a responsibility that we take seriously, and we are looking forward to continued collaboration with policymakers such as yourself, Tom, and your team, and make sure that this one of its kind act does not just remain another act, but we push the idea of it being implemented and being realizable by the beneficiaries on the ground. And with that, I would like to pause, and I'm looking forward to the interactions moving forward during this session. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you for the kind words and encouragement. I just looked through the participant list, and I see Dr. Wendland is with us, and my colleagues from the DSI, and I see our IKS ambassadors and other distinguished participants. Thank you very much for attending. Prof, just a word, and Shumi is gonna talk more around the processes, because through the World Intellectual Property Right Organization and regional forums, what we had is a number of requests as to how did we go about developing this historic framework. So much of Shumi's, or I would say a fairly large chunk of her presentation is we're going to run those participants who indicated that they would want to come is to the process as to how we went through. She's not going to go through the article by article, but she's just going to give the broad framework in terms of the act. So with that, I would, by the way, Prof, just an important thing is that when we started the legislation, we identified misappropriation and biopiracy as a pandemic. So this fits in very well in terms of what Shumi is going to say now. So with that, Shumi, can I call you to do your presentation?
Thanks, Chair. Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you in this platform as we are going to take you through the IKS policy, including the legislative landscape in South Africa, for those of us who are attending who are non-South African. I am so sad that I cannot see your faces, because I would have loved to see your expressions as I'm talking to you. And I think you are sharing the same sentiments. You would have loved to see me. But now, because of this new normal, we can't see each other. Without any waste of time, I just wanted to take you through the genesis of the IKS policy in South Africa, and that will include where we are now, which talks to the IK Act of 2019. In the dawn of democracy in South Africa, there were a number of issues that were identified, which were a residue that was brought to us by both colonization and the apartheid system. And part of those issues that were prioritized by the government was the indigenous knowledge. And the motivation behind this was the understanding and knowledge of the rich biodiversity that South Africa has. And for many years, South Africa has been ranked number 3 in the whole world as one of the mega biodiverse countries. But when it comes to the economic development of communities who are the holders of this indigenous knowledge, which is as a consequence of the rich culture and the rich biodiversity. The scales were not showing. In fact, the reflection that we could see in the mirror was a very bad reflection of poverty that has become synonymous with the communities. And therefore, government started the process of finding a way of how this indigenous knowledge can be protected. And a number of submissions were made, even including presentations to Parliament and submissions to Parliament. And if you look at the slide that is showing there, you will notice that the actual process started in 2002. This is now following a number of attempts that were made to come up with an instrument or a framework that will assist in the protection of indigenous knowledge. And this indigenous knowledge that we have in South Africa has been defined by, first of all, the understanding that indigenous knowledge is communally owned. In other words, it has to be protected in its own terms by its own people. And because the government has the responsibility of coming up with policies, then the government had to assist the process, but the bulk of the information had to come from the communities themselves, because this is now giving them a new right of defining themselves in terms of what it is that they stand for, their values, their culture, their spiritual beliefs, and so on. And as we would understand, indigenous knowledge is a cross-cutter, and therefore it becomes a way of life which is not limited. And I want to stress this, it is not limited to health practitioners and their practices and beliefs, but it cuts across a number of disciplines that will include your indigenous farming, indigenous games, indigenous governance, your indigenous astronomy, and a wide range of activities that make us as a people. So in 2002, then, the Department of Arts and Culture, Science and Technology, which was under the same ministry at the time, requested HSRC, which is Human Science Research Council, to manage the redrafting. And I want to emphasize this redrafting was because of the several prior attempts to come up with a policy. But all of those were rejected by Parliament because they were not covering everything that needs to be covered in the protection of indigenous knowledge. So a committee was formed, which was going to be responsible for driving this process. And a number of reports were submitted. Extensive consultations with key stakeholders were undertaken, not only locally, but internationally as well. And a number of instruments such as WIPO, UNEP, UNDP, and World Health Organization were also consulted. And they were consulted on the basis of the role in the space that we wanted to tap into. And they already have some kind of policies that more or less address the issues that we wanted to address within the space of indigenous knowledge. So a number of countries were visited, consulted, and a lot of reading and comparative studies were made. And the countries that were visited were those that are like-minded. In other words, they are sharing the same, more or less, knowledge, they share the same resources, but most importantly, they share the same challenges that South Africa find itself trapped in. So the drafting continued and the submissions were made. All those consultations were done nationally and internationally, including consultations within the continent. So in 2004, the IKS policy was adopted by the South African cabinet, which contains overarching principles for recognition, affirmation, development, and promotion of indigenous knowledge. And it was important to have these overarching principles, because the first thing that happens when one has been oppressed for so long, the oppression takes away the confidence, it takes away the cultural values, it takes away the principles that make us as a people. It erodes all those values. So the question of recognition and affirmation were very important, so that we do some kind of telling our people and assuring our people how important their knowledge is in the face of globalization. So this IKS policy then, one of the imperatives was the establishment of an office, which was then called the National Indigenous Knowledge Systems Office, which Tom and myself are part of. And within those, within that office, which then was attached, as it still is, to the Department of Science and Innovation. Within that office, 3 units were established. The first unit was around advocacy and policy development. The second one was knowledge management, which deals with everything that has to do with registering, documenting, cataloging of indigenous knowledge in all the 9 provinces of South Africa. And what that unit did at the time was to undergo or undertake an audit process, just to get a feel of what information is where, in what form, and how then will it inform the processes that the knowledge management unit need to address. The third unit was called knowledge development, which has evolved now to be IK-based innovation. That unit was responsible for everything that talks to research and new product development, and a lot of work has been done in that space. One of the most important imperatives of the IKS policy was the development of a legislation for the protection, promotion, development, and management of indigenous knowledge. And as some of us will understand, a policy is just a statement of intent. It looks at the what. What is the mischief? What needs to happen? What is happening? But after that has been said, it doesn't explain then how we address those things that we have identified, which is the reason why then it was important for a legislation to be developed. And that legislation was going to address the how. Now that we have the what, how then do we address all these issues that we have identified? I can gladly say, in terms of the implementation of the IKS policy, we should be now 99.9% into the implementation, because the development of the legislation has been the last assignment which the department had to tackle. And I am going to take you through how far that process has been. But most of you will know that already we have an act that has been signed by the president. And as Professor Neshandama has indicated, it was a really bumpy road. It was not an easy task because, one, this is something that has never happened, more especially in the sub-Saharan part of Africa. So we had to do that with the understanding that what we are doing is more or less talking to some legislations that are already in place. And one of those is the intellectual property laws. But at the time we were drafting, so we had to start with the drafting of the legislation for the protection, promotion, development, and management of indigenous knowledge, taking into account that intellectual property is the creation of the mind that manifests itself in different disciplines. So as the communities are there interacting with one another, intellectual activities happen, creativity happens, and then it manifests in its different forms. Now, one would ask, if then we're talking about intellectual property and we already have intellectual property laws, why was there a need for this legislation? I mentioned earlier in my presentation that indigenous knowledge is communally owned. So when we look at this act, we will see a situation where the benefits and everything that goes with it happens communally. There's a slide that I've shown there in your screen that juxtaposes the two processes, the intellectual property regime as it is now and the kind of legislation that we have developed, which is a sui generis legislation, one of its kind. One of its kind because it deals with issues that have never been dealt with before, or it separates itself a little bit from the norm. Why is it different then? If you look at the left-hand side of the screen, I have listed what the intellectual property regime looks like and what it protects and how it protects. On the right-hand side, I have listed the sui generis and how it should protect. The conventional IP regime concentrate on the economic benefits, and the ownership of those benefits are as they relate to the individual. And it has a stipulated amount of term depending on the discipline under question. And the tools that we normally have there are your copyrights as we know them. You have an idea, you reduce it into material form, and then you have a book, you have a story, you have a poem, whatever the case may be. But you have this idea and you reduce it to material form. You have a trademark and you protect your product. You have a patent that you have, all of that becomes yours. You are given an exclusive right for protection and for your benefits, which are economic by nature. And we have industrial designs. So the criteria that is used there is that this must be reduced in material form if it's a copyright. If it's a trademark, it must demonstrate distinctiveness. If it's a patent, it must have that novelty and the inventive steps and a lot of others that I'm not going to mention in the interest of time. But if I were to zoom into the kind of legislation that we have come up with, it doesn't only focus on the economic benefit. It also includes the moral benefit. So the community should benefit morally in terms of the knowledge that they have. And there is also customary benefit that the community benefits once their knowledge is known and respected. And the ownership is collective, as I indicated. And the intention of this act is to make the protection of the indigenous knowledge perpetual. In other words, whilst in the patent you will have 20 years of exclusive right, with indigenous knowledge, it must be protected in perpetuity. But there are also conditions that have to be met there, which have been described under the criteria and the eligibility criteria for protection of indigenous knowledge. One of them is that this knowledge that has to be protected under this act must have been passed from generation to generation. In other words, it must be knowledge that has been known since time immemorial, and generations have been using this knowledge. And it must be associated with the social and cultural identity of a community. So if, for instance, I will just make an example. If you see a Ndebele print, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. Once you see those colors, that print, those combination of colors, your mind already says this is a Ndebele print, so it's associated with that community and it forms part of their identity. If you see this, what we call Xhosa Mpaco, once you see those colors and how they are arranged and everything, you are already saying in your mind, this is a Xhosa attire. So that means it is associated with a social and cultural identity of the community. It must be used, maintained, and developed. In other words, the communities must keep on working on this knowledge and it must evolve over time. An example of that would be your likes of Umhlonyane, which has been a buzzword, more especially during this time of COVID-19. In the years, that Mhlonyane was just used as a shrub, as a plant, and in whatever use it would be represented in that form. But if the communities have to be encouraged to work on it, it then takes different forms. It could be a tablet, it could be a syrup, it could be maybe infused to some of the food that we eat. That is what we mean by developed. In terms of the tools that talk to indigenous knowledge, we include folklore, we include databases, we include genetic resources and indigenous knowledge as a whole. So the criteria, it has to be embedded in a local community, and it has to have that intergenerational context of collective ownership. I'm not going to get into detail with that. That was just to demonstrate the current IP regime and how it is evolving over time to include other areas as well. In the first slide, it was just the four of them, but with time, as knowledge evolves, we have now included geographical indications. We have traditional knowledge as the new baby on the block. We have plant breeders' rights, which is also one of the disciplines that has to be protected. Now, in terms of the processes that were followed in the drafting of the IK Act, this was an in-house work that was done within DSI, and we consulted within the department because we also understood that there should be and there could be elements of indigenous knowledge that are sitting in different programs of the department. So they had to make their inputs insofar as the indigenous knowledge and research is concerned. As you know, part of the mandate of science and innovation is on research. So as Professor Nchandamo was mentioning here, there are new products that come as a consequence of research within the communities. And therefore the department as a whole had to make inputs on the process. Here is just a demonstration of what processes were followed and in which form. But now, we are at the point where the Indigenous Knowledge Act has been signed into law in 2019. In this slide, I just wanted to share a little bit of what I've mentioned earlier, which more or less gives you an idea of what we mean by this indigenous traditional knowledge. And you will notice that in that slide, indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge are used interchangeably. In the South African context, politically, it has been decided that we will use indigenous knowledge. But elsewhere in the world, traditional knowledge is the term used to define the same subject matter. But it is this knowledge that is resulting from intellectual activity in the traditional context. And this includes the know-how of the communities, the skills that they have developed over time, and the innovations that they use, practices and learning that form part of their traditional system. In other words, they assimilate some of this knowledge, and this knowledge evolves as they interact with one another, as they interact with the environment. So it is also not limited to any specific field. And as I indicated before, we also want to demystify this notion that says Indigenous knowledge is only about health practices. The health practice within the Indigenous context, Indigenous knowledge context, is just one small component of the bigger picture. Up to now, the department has identified 16 disciplines that form part of this Indigenous knowledge. I mentioned a few in my introduction. That will be your Indigenous farming, your Indigenous games, your governance, your astronomy, and health is one of them, as I indicated. The criteria, I've mentioned that it must be passed on from generation to generation. It has been developed within an Indigenous community and is associated with the social and cultural identity of that community. I'm going to take you through now the focus of the Act. The other slides that are going to follow, colleagues, are just an expansion of what I'm going to be presenting to you. But for the benefit of this presentation and in the interest of time, I'm going to concentrate on this slide and I will not move from this slide. If I have to share the presentation, you will see how this then pans out in the slides that are to follow. The mischief or the problem statement that the IK Act focuses on is to tackle the issue around biopiracy. And this is the worst of them all, as Professor Nechendama mentioned, that this ivory tower mentality where researchers, or should I say third parties, would go to the communities, get what they want in their own terms, leave the community poorer than it was before, or even in the same state they found themselves, is what this Act seeks to address. And it is not only limited to biopiracy, it is just piracy in its entirety. So this is a question where the third party gets into the community and uses this Indigenous knowledge and resources associated with Indigenous knowledge without permission from the communities. And in addressing this biopiracy, we have taken from the Nagoya Protocol the principles of biocultural protocol that seeks to define and redefine the communities in their own right. And this is giving the communities now a right to either allow or deny access to their communities and their resources. And how is this going to happen? Within the principles of the biocultural protocol, we really need to encourage the communities to be organized. Organized communities will then understand their traditional leadership, which is a very important factor that even the government is endorsing through the legal frameworks, where the traditional leadership has been given now powers to be recognized as the first port of entry before you can even do anything within the communities. So the communities themselves, they need to understand how the decision-making powers are, how they should be approached. In other words, the communities now determine how they should be engaged with as it relates to their knowledge, their genetic resources associated with their knowledge, and any other project that is proposed by the third party. And misappropriation has also been a very bad exercise that has hit the communities very hard. We have examples of this where material in its different forms, it could be knowledge or tangible resources, has been taken from the communities. And the worst thing that happens is when this information or knowledge or resources are not respected by the third parties. Communities have their own values, they have their own cultures, they have their own beliefs and ideas. There is knowledge that resides with the communities that is secret and sacred. But when it comes to the third parties accessing those communities, all that diminishes. And what becomes key is the economic benefit that accrues only to that individual who wants to utilize that resource. And that has become a pandemic, so to speak. It has left the communities naked, because once somebody takes away your pride, you are left with nothing. So that misappropriation is a reality that the Act wants to address. And in that space of biopiracy and misappropriation, the biocultural protocol becomes the messiah, because even the terms of engagement are discussed with the communities, and a prior informed consent has to be entered into. And this prior informed consent has to be concluded with the understanding that the community has to be given all the information that pertains to the activity that has to be happening there, whether inside the community or outside the community, for as long as that community information and knowledge and resources are going to be used. That prior informed consent must be in mutually agreed terms. That prior informed consent must be communicated in a language that the communities understand. And if it means there must be an interpreter who's going to interpret the language that is foreign to the community, to the language they understand, the communities must be granted that. So that all of this now, once it is concluded in mutually agreed terms, with all the transparency, with all the legal certainty of how this project is going to be. And in terms of the research institutions, we have also developed research ethics that assist the institutions on how to go about engaging with communities. It gives a step-by-step of how they are expected to behave and how the communities themselves should engage with the third party. In other words, this act is having a very strong balance between the user and the resource, so that none of the two are disadvantaged in the process. The third issue that the Act seeks to address is the promotion of registration of indigenous knowledge. What this means is that, as I indicated earlier, that we have a unit that deals with the cataloging and the documentation of indigenous knowledge. We have come to understand in a very harsh way that if our knowledge is not registered, we are going to find ourselves in this vicious circle where knowledge is taken away from us without any prior informed consent, without any benefits that accrue to the provider be it a country or a community, but the provider is left with nothing whilst the user has benefited everything. But if there is nothing that is documented to demonstrate where this resource or knowledge comes from, which community has which claims, then we will forever be exploited. So this act promotes the registration of indigenous knowledge. What the department has done so far is to establish IKS documentation centers in all 9 provinces in South Africa. And that now allows the communities to document the knowledge that they know, the knowledge that they have, and the recorders have been employed by DSI to record this communally owned information and knowledge in the communities. They are also guided by these principles of the biocultural protocol. The recorders have been trained to understand the biocultural protocol, which means they will not just barge into the communities and document whatever they see, or just take people without those people understanding what they're getting themselves into and document their knowledge, because at the end of the day, there are intellectual property rights or intellectual property issues that might leave the community and never to be gained again. And somebody will be benefiting out of all that. So the recorders have to be very clued up in terms of the processes, the village protocols, the biocultural protocols that need to be followed as a guiding process on the recording of this information. So that knowledge now is in the documentation centers in the 9 provinces in South Africa. And we also realize that because of the vastness of the provinces, we don't need only one documentation center. We need a lot because the communities are very large, very spread out. So for easy access, we need to have at least enough documentation centers so that they are able to service the communities easier and more efficiently. So what's going to happen according to this registration system is that the Act provides that the communities nominate a trustee, trustees, which is something that translates into a board of trustees. This board of trustees will be appointed according to the Trustees Act. So this board of trustees will be the ones that represent the communities in all things related to indigenous knowledge. If there's a third party that needs to work with the community, they will do that through the trustees as the entry point. The DSI will not dictate or prescribe to the communities who they must nominate as their trustees. They will nominate their trustees, and according to the Trustees Act, they will be registered also as the trustees within the office. So the Act says, within the National Indigenous Knowledge Systems Office, which is an office now that will be established through the Act, a curator's office will also be established. So the trustee then will be the interface between the office and the community. The trustee will then apply to the curator for the registration of the community knowledge. In other words, that knowledge that is already residing within the documentation centers will be taken by the trustee into the registration of process, which is at the National Indigenous Knowledge Systems Office. What the curator then will do, will check on this knowledge and see if this knowledge fits all the criteria as prescribed by the law. Passed on from generation to generation, have the social and cultural identity of the community, it must be used, developed, and maintained. So if it meets all the criteria, it will then be registered. In other words, we have 2 levels. We have the documentation process and we have the registration process. But if that information doesn't qualify, it doesn't mean it must be thrown away. It will still be information relevant for the documentation center so that that information is not lost. We have learned a lesson on this registration through the traditional digital library, the TKDL, Traditional Knowledge Digital Library of India. This is when there were patents that were registered somewhere in the world by an individual who accessed this resource and knowledge from India. But because there was that digital library where this knowledge was registered, India was able to show proof that this knowledge belongs to India and those patents were revoked. So South Africa is following the same process to say, for as long as our knowledge is not registered, we cannot be able to challenge any infringement that happens as a consequence of using our knowledge without our permission to a point of registering it for protection somewhere else by an individual who's not part of the community. So once this curator then registers this knowledge and it has passed all the eligibility criteria, a certificate of registration will be issued by the curator. And as indicated, this is communally owned. That benefit, when that utilization has happened, there's research that happens along that resource, the community, not the individual, the community will benefit out of that. That certificate then will serve as proof that this community has registered this knowledge. This act also takes into account the fact that there will be multiple ownership or custodianship, where different communities own or are custodians to the same knowledge. This talks to situations where there is a resource that grows in many areas of South Africa, and the communities have the same knowledge around this resource. It could be the knowledge not even associated with a resource, knowledge of something. It could be astronomy, it could be leadership issues, it could be governance issues, where different communities have the same knowledge. It could be traditional cultural expressions owned and are practiced by different communities on the same subject matter. The Act takes into consideration such issues. And the communities, no matter how many, will also benefit out of the utilization of that knowledge. Benefit sharing will be concluded with all those communities. And we have an issue where this knowledge and resource associated with this knowledge is also occurring in other countries outside the Republic of South Africa. So this Act takes into account the transboundary issues, which means then we are tapping at this point into the Nagoya Protocol. As South Africa is also a signatory to the Nagoya Protocol, all member states who are signatories to the Nagoya Protocol are mandated to develop or come up with competent authorities. In the South African context, the Department of Environmental, Forestry and Fisheries is the South African competent authority, according to the Nagoya Protocol. And in those competent authorities, there will be focal people. If there is a third party that comes out of South Africa or outside Africa, and they have identified a resource in South Africa then must alert other member states of the Nagoya who have the same resource to say, this is an application we have received, and we are not the only country that have this resource. And aloe comes to my mind. We have the aloe in South Africa. It also occurs in Namibia. It grows in Lesotho, and the knowledge associated with this aloe is the same. So it means that third party will have to conclude a benefit sharing agreement with all those countries. And those countries will get into a memorandum of agreement so that the discussions are done in a manner that is manageable, and there is a legal certainty that talks to what each party is expected to do. That is the resource country and the user country. So those benefits will have to be shared amongst the communities. They will have to be shared amongst the countries. So this act also facilitates research and development. And I think Tom will attest to the fact that when we were still drafting this was met with so much apprehension, more especially by researchers and industry, because to them it seemed as if now that we are going to stifle the research. This thing is going to be so cumbersome, they don't know what they are going to do. And we've always been saying to them, if only you comply and if only you allow us to assist you in the process, it is so easy. There is nothing cumbersome. In fact, the last thing we want to happen, the last thing we want to see happen is the research that is coming to an end, or delayed research, or delayed product development. We are actually wanting to encourage new product development. We want the communities to be part of this process. We want these communities to stop now being tappers, collecting the harvest and just stopping there. They must be part of this resource, rather part of this research. If it means they must also be in that laboratory where these active ingredients are separated, they must be part of that. They must know that this resource in its natural form, it has other things that may have unintended consequences. So when we get to the laboratory, we remove all those things. We come up with efficient, safe products for the society to utilize. That is exactly what we want. But it must be done in a manner that is fair and transparent to the communities. And that is where the technology transfers will also happen as a two-way process, to say our organic researchers are also benefiting from the conventional Western researchers and vice versa. So this must be a two-way process. At the end of the day, we want fair, equitable sharing of benefits. And once we talk about, I'm now coming towards the end of my presentation, once we talk about benefit sharing, in the minds of everybody, including the users and the resource people, money comes to the head. And we need to manage those expectations, because there is a lot of disputes that are going to arise as a consequence. There are going to be situations where other communities feel that they are more of beneficiaries than the others. There are going to be, we are not here in the patent space where we have the first to file issues. Here we are saying, even if you were the first one to register according to the registration system, and later in the process, there is 1,001 that comes as number 1,000 in the queue, they are as much of beneficiaries as the first one. So those disputes, there are mechanisms that the Act has put in place. They are explained in detail in the regulations in terms of what will happen, at what interval, what interventions will be made available until all the possibilities have been explored. So we have put those mechanisms in place, and we have tapped into the bond guidelines in terms of the types of benefits that should be considered when concluding this benefit sharing agreement. There will be monetary benefits, which will be calculated in terms of percentages that translates to rands and cents. There will be non-monetary benefits that will also be considered when concluding this. The bond guidelines has something like 16 or 26 examples of the non-monetary benefits. It could be workshops, conferences, co-authoring of journals, skills transfer, and a number of other benefits that can be considered as part of the benefit sharing. So in this dispute resolution, we are very much aware that sometimes the communities will think that we'll just sit down and wait for the third party to come, and then we'll conclude the benefit sharing and boom, we'll be millionaires. No, we are not suggesting that. We also don't want the communities to have that impression. There will be a case-by-case situation where in other cases, this access to this community and their resource will not culminate into any economic benefit. So this should be made clear to the communities in that biocultural protocol where the project is explained. The whole project must be transparently explained to the satisfaction of everyone. Where the benefits are likely to accrue, even the milestones of that should be explained, because even if ultimately this is going to come up with economic benefits, it might not be an overnight success. So as the project grows and develops, so the benefit sharing arrangements should be made in terms of percentages. At this level, this is how much percentage we will be able to share. At that level, this is how much percentage we'll be able to share. So there are also unintended consequences to this. So those mechanisms that have been put in place are put in place to address even those disputes that may arise. They might arise within the communities. They might arise outside the borders of South Africa, where, as I said, the resources are also found. So the Act is also aware that such disputes might happen. Yeah, so I think in a nutshell, this is what the IK Act focuses on. And if maybe I have left anything important as we engage further, I will be able to explain such. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Shumi, for that thorough presentation. We just have one more speaker, and then I'm going to open the floor for questions of clarity or for comments. Julian, are we with the chief?
Yes, Chief,
Yes.
the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, colleagues. Chief Mabunguto Dramaplana. My presentation is like this. As a South African, we in South Africa, we call ourselves one nation, but different culture, religion, and the way of living. As Givalda, a custodian and researcher of indigenous medicine. An example where I quoted some few examples. During these days, our forefathers utilized some method which form part of indigenous. If somebody might be affected by chickenpox, they just utilize a calabash whereby somebody will go and talk right facing the inside of the calabash, then that somebody will be healed within 24 hours. Also, if a child born with a bent neck, an uncle can be called and touch that affected part of the neck by just a mere an elbow, then that somebody will get healed. To me, it forms the importance of indigenous. Then also, if we don't speak of our indigenous, it will be like somebody we just throw a legacy in the grave. Then, according to my understanding, each and every tribe has got its own of dealing with or treating various alignments. Then, so today or nowadays, we are so lucky because the government of the day is also paying attention to the knowledge holders whatsoever. And this will make the IKS to survive, and we can put in the form of a restoration. Then during this time of a pandemic, most of the people can tell today that they benefited because our young generation, even we elders, we were trying to, or we were away with our own way of living, of which we acquired from our forefathers. So during pandemic, people utilize various alignments since we were frustrated. Then some of the people or elderly people come up with the idea that in olden days we were utilizing this and that. Then, so I understand that during this time, how could we keep and restore this IKS? The government of the day is giving the stakeholders an opportunity to participate in the formulation of rules, which will lead us to the creation of law and the governing of the future of IKS. Senior citizens are also engaged. Traditional leaders or healers and chiefs are also invited to put more input or to make more meat on the bone so that we can practice this. So, ladies and gentlemen, to me, today I feel honored by doing this presentation so that we can do something different, because people who don't know their culture and not keeping whatever they know, in future, this coming generation will no longer, or they will go and point our graves that you guys, you didn't keep what we should be utilizing today. So by these few words, I can say thank you. Bye. Hello.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you, Chief.
Yeah. Just to mention is that the last speaker, Chief, he's a traditional leader. He's a traditional health practitioner. He's an innovator and a businessman. So he's all in one, and he encompasses what IK is all about. Just one point that I need to make before I open the floor for questions is that, and I see my colleagues from WIPO here, is that the act is unique in the sense is that what we are negotiating at the World Intellectual Property Rights Organization are three different texts: one for traditional knowledge, one for traditional cultural expression, and one on genetic resources. So what we've done, we've collapsed the three texts into one act. So we found that there are lots of commonalities in the three texts. So this makes it unique, and it's about the only law that has the three texts in one act.